The Grifters by Jim Thompson, read by James Edmondson and Joan Stewart Morris. As Roy Dillon stumbled out of the shop, his face was a sickish green, and each breath he drew was an incredible agony. A hard blow in the guts can do that to a man, and Dillon had gotten a hard one. Not with a fist, which would have been bad enough, but from the butt end of a heavy club. Somehow, he got back to his car and managed to slide into the seat, but that was all he could manage. He moaned as the change in posture cramped his stomach muscles. Then, with a strangled gasp, he leaned out of the window. Several cars passed as he spewed vomit into the street, their occupants grinning, frowning sympathetically, or averting their eyes in disgust. But Roy was too sick to notice or to care. When at last his stomach was empty, he felt better, though still not well enough to drive. By then, however, a prowl car had pulled up behind him, a sheriff's car, since he was in the county rather than city of Los Angeles, and a brown-clad deputy was inviting him to step out to the walk. Dillon shakily obeyed. "Just one too many, mister?" "What?" "No, never mind." The cop had already noticed the absence of liquor breath. "Let's see your driver's license." Dillon showed it to him, also displaying with seeming inadvertence an assortment of credit cards. Suspicion washed off the cop's face, giving way to concern. "You seem pretty sick, Mr. Dillon. Any idea what caused it?" My lunch, I guess. I had a chicken salad sandwich, and it didn't taste quite right when I was eating it, but, Well, that stuff will do it to you. Well, you all right now? Want us to take you to a doctor?" "Oh, no. I'm fine." Any prolonged contact with the cops would result in a record, and any kind of record was at best a nuisance. So far he had none. The scrapes which the grift had led him into had not led him to the cops, and he meant to keep it that way. The deputy went back to the prowl car, and he and his partner drove off. Roy waved a smiling farewell to them and got back into his own car. Gingerly, wincing a little, he got a cigarette lit. Then, convinced that the last of the vomiting was over, he forced himself to lean back against the cushions. He was in a suburb of Los Angeles. From here, it was almost a 30-mile drive back into the city, a very long 30 miles at this hour of the day. He needed to be in better shape than he was, to rest a while before bucking the outbound tide of evening traffic. More important, he needed to reconstruct the details of his recent disaster while they still remained fresh in his mind. He closed his eyes. He was back inside the shop, sipping a limeade at the fountain while he casually studied his surroundings. It was little different from 1,000 small shops in Los Angeles, establishments with an abbreviated soda fountain, a showcase or two of cigars, cigarettes, and candy, and overflowing racks of magazines, paperback books, and greeting cards. Dillon was the only customer in the place. The one other person present was the clerk, a large, lumpy-looking youth of perhaps 19 or 20. As Dillon finished his drink, he noted the boy's manner as he tapped ice down around the freezer containers, working with a paradoxical mixture of diligence and indifference. He knew exactly what needed to be done, and to hell with doing a bit more than that. The boss's son, Dillon decided, sliding off the stool. He sauntered up toward the cash register, and the youth laid down the sawed-off ball bat with which he had been tamping. Then, wiping his hands on his apron, he also moved to the register. 10 cents. And a package of those mints, too. 20 cents. 20 cents, huh? Now, I know I've got some change here. I wonder where the devil... I'm sorry. Mind cashing at 20? The clerk almost snatched the bill from his hand. He slapped the bill down on the cash register ledge and counted out the change from the drawer. Dillon absently picked it up, continuing his fumbling search of his pockets. Now, doesn't that get you? I mean, you know darn well you've got something, but, there it is. 2 dimes. Just give me back my 20, will you? The clerk grabbed the dimes from him and tossed back the bill. Dillon turned casually toward the door, pausing on the way out for a disinterested glance at the magazine display. Thus, for the 10th time that day, he had worked the 20s, one of the 3 standard gimmicks of the short con grift. Dillon didn't see the clerk come around the counter. The guy was just there all of a sudden, a pouting snarl on his face, swinging the sawed-off bat like a battering ram. "Dirty crook! Dirty crooks keep cheating me, and Papa cusses me out for it." The butt of the bat landed in Dillon's stomach. Even the clerk was startled by its effects. Now, you can't blame me, mister. You were asking for it. I give you change for $20, and then you have me give the 20 back, and... Now, you know you did, mister." Roy could think of nothing but his agony. He turned swimming eyes on the clerk, eyes flooded with pain-filled puzzlement. The look demolished the youth. It was just a mistake, mister. You made a mistake, and I made a mistake, and... Mister, don't look at me like that." "You killed me, you rotten bastard." "No, please don't say that, mister." "I'm dying." Somehow, he had gotten out of the place. As he drove back to Los Angeles, constantly braking and speeding up in the thickening traffic, with every passing minute, he was dying. Roy Dillon's mother was from a family of backwoods white trash. She was 13 when she married a 30-year-old railroad worker, and not quite 14 when she gave birth to Roy. A month or so after his birth, her husband suffered an accident which made her a widow. Thanks to the circumstances of its happening, it also made her well off by the community's standards, a whole $200 a month to spend on herself, which was right where she meant to spend it. Her family, on whom she promptly dumped Roy, had other ideas. They kept the boy for 3 years, occasionally managing to wheedle a few dollars from their daughter. Then one day, her father appeared in town, bearing Roy under one arm and swinging a horsewhip with the other, and he proceeded to demonstrate his lifelong theory that a gal never got too old to whip. Since Lily Dillon's character had been molded long before, it was little changed by the thrashing, but she did keep Roy, having no choice in the matter, and frightened by her father's grim promises to keep an eye on her, she moved out of his reach. Settling down in Baltimore, she found lucrative and undemanding employment as a bee girl, or more accurately, it was undemanding as far as she was concerned. Lily wasn't putting out for anyone, not at least for a few bucks or drinks. Her nominal heartlessness often disgruntled the customers, but it drew the favorable attention of her employers. After all, the world was full of bimbos, tramps who could be had for a grin or a gin, but a smart kid, a doll who not only had looks and class but was also smart, well, that kind of kid you could use. They used her in increasingly responsible capacities, as a managing hostess, as a recruiter for a chain of establishments, as a spotter of sticky-fingered and bungling employees, as courier, liaison officer, finger woman, as a collector and disburser, and so on up the ladder. The money poured in, but little of the shower settled on her son. She wanted to pack him off to boarding school, only drawing back indignantly when the charges were quoted to her. Nuisance that he was, she'd just look after Roy herself, and he darn well better keep out of trouble or she'd skin him alive. She had her rare moments of conscience. Also, certain things had to be done for the sake of appearances, to stifle charges of neglect and the unpleasantness pursuant thereto. In either case, as Roy instinctively knew, whatever she did was for herself, out of fear or as a salve for her conscience. Generally, her attitude was that of a selfish older sister to an annoying little brother. He was an excellent student in school. Learning came easily for him, and good behavior seemed simply a matter of common sense. Why risk trouble when it didn't make you anything? Why be profitlessly detained after school when you could be out hustling newspapers or running errands or caddying? Time was money, and money was what made the world go round. As the smartest and best-behaved boy in his classes, he naturally drew the displeasure of the other kind. But no matter how cruelly or frequently he was attacked, Lily offered only sardonic condolence.
"Only one arm?"
she would say if he exhibited a twisted or a swollen arm, or if a tooth had been knocked out.
"Only one tooth?"
And when he received an overall mauling with threats of worse to come.
"Well, what are you kicking about? They may kill you, but they can't eat you."
Oddly enough, he found a certain comfort in her remarks. On the surface, they were worse than nothing, merely insult added to injury. but beneath them lay a chilling logic, a fatalistic do-or-be-damned philosophy which could accommodate itself to anything but oblivion. He had no liking for Lily, but he came to admire her. She'd done all right. She knew how to take care of herself. She showed no soft spots until he entered his teens, a handsome, wholesome-looking youth with coal-black hair and wide-set gray eyes. Then, to his secret amusement, he began to note a softening of her voice when she spoke to him, and a suppressed hunger in her eyes when she looked at him. By the time he was 17, going on 18, the spring that he graduated from high school, he was as mature as a man in his 20s. On the night of his graduation, he told Lily that he was pulling out, for good.
Pulling out?
She'd been expecting that, he guessed, but she wasn't resigned to it.
But you can't. You've got to go to college.
Can't. No money. She laughed shakily and called him silly, avoiding his eyes, refusing to be rejected as she must have known she would be.
Of course you have money. I've got plenty, and anything I have is yours.
Anything I have is yours. That would make a good title for a song, Lily.
You can go to one of those really good schools, Roy. Harvard or Yale or someplace like that. Your grades are certainly good enough, and with my money, our money.
Now, Lily, you know you need the money for yourself. You always have.
Don't be mean to me, Roy, please. Please don't. You're breaking my heart.
Roy laughed out loud. He couldn't restrain himself. Only one heart, Lily? Roy lived in a hotel called the Grosvenor Carlton, a name which hinted at a grandeur that was non-existent. There were 80 rooms and 35 baths, and those included the hall baths and the 2 lobby restrooms, which were not really baths at all. It was a 4-story affair with a white sandstone facade and small terrazzo-floored lobby. Generally speaking, the Grosvenor Carlton was little different than the numerous other family and commercial hotels which are strung out along West 7th and Santa Monica and other arterial streets of West Los Angeles. Establishments catering to retired couples and working men and women who required a close-in address. During his 4-year tenancy at the hotel, he had had only one female visitor, a divorcee in her 30s. The only fault he could find with her was that she did not come often enough. For Maura Langtry was also discriminating. Given her own way, something that Dillon frequently refrained from giving her as a matter of policy, she wouldn't have come within a mile of the Grosvenor Carlton. After all, she had a very nice apartment of her own. If he really wanted to see her, and she was beginning to doubt that he did, why couldn't he come out there?
Well, why can't you?
She said as he sat up in bed phoning to her.
It's no further for you than it is for me.
Yeah, but you're so much younger, dear. A youthful female like you can afford to humor a doddering old man.
Flattery will get you nowhere, mister. I'm 5 years older, and I feel every minute of it.
Dillon grinned. 5 years older. Hell, she was 10 if she was a day. The fact is, I'm a little under the weather. No, it's nothing contagious. I happened to trip over a chair the other night in the dark, and it gave me a nasty whack in the stomach.
Well, I guess I could come.
That's my girl. I'd hold my breath if I wasn't panting.
Mm-hmm. Let's hear you.
Pant.
You poor thing. Moira will hurry just as fast as she can.
She arrived in less than an hour, or perhaps it only seemed that way. He had got up to unlock the door, preparatory to her arrival, and returning to bed, he had felt strangely tired and faint. So he had let his eyes drift shut, and when he opened them, a very little later, seemingly, she was entering the room. Sweeping into it on her tiny spiked-heeled shoes, a billowing but compact bundle of woman with glossily black hair and direct, darkly burning eyes. She paused just inside the threshold for a moment, self-assured but suppliant. His silent approval spoke to her. She gave a little twitch to her body, letting the ermine stole hang from one shoulder. Then, hips swaying delicately, she came slowly across the room, small chin outthrust, seemingly tugged forward by the bountiful imbalance within the small white blouse. She stopped with her knees pressed against his bed, and, looking upward, he could see nothing but the tip of her nose above the contours of her breasts. She sank gracefully to her knees, let her dark eyes burn into his face. You smell good, Moira. Like a bitch in a hothouse.
Darling, what a beautiful thing to say.
Maybe you don't smell good.
I do, too. You just said so.
It could be your clothes.
It's me. Want me to prove it to you?
He did. And she did. She sat up, swinging her legs off the bed, and got a cigarette from the reading stand. After it was lit, he took it for himself, and she got herself another.
Roy, look at me.
Believe me, I am.
Now, please. Is this all we have, Roy? Is it all we're going to have? I'm not knocking it, understand, but shouldn't there be something more?
How could we top a thing like that? Tickle each other's feet? She looked at him silently, the burning eyes turning lackluster, staring at him from behind an invisible veil. Without turning her head, she extended a hand and slowly tamped out her cigarette. That was a funny. You were supposed to laugh.
Oh, I am laughing, dear. Believe me, I am.
She reached down, picked up a stocking, and began to draw it on. A little troubled, he pulled her around to face him. What are you driving at, Moira? Marriage?
I didn't say that.
But that's what I asked.
I don't think so. I'm a very practical little girl, and I don't believe in giving any more than I get. That might be pretty awkward for a matchbook salesman. Or whatever you are.
Oh, would you mind handing me my first aid kit? I think I've just been clawed.
Don't worry. Kitty's had all her shots.
The fact is, the matchbooks are just a sideline. My real business is running a whorehouse. For his first year in Los Angeles, he was strictly a square John, an independent salesman calling on small businessmen. Gliding back into the grift, he remained a salesman, and he was still one now. He had a credit rating and a bank account. He was acquainted with literally hundreds of people who would attest to the excellence of his character. Security gave him self-assurance. Security and self-assurance had bred a high degree of skill. In accomplishing so much, he had no time for women. Nothing but the casual contacts which any young man might have. It was not until late in his third year that he had started looking around for a particular kind of woman. Someone who was not only highly desirable, but who would be willing to, even prefer to, accept the only kind of arrangement which he was willing to offer. He found her, Moira Langtry, that is, in church. It was one of those screwball outfits which seem to flourish on the West Coast. The head clown was a yogi or a swami or something of the kind. While his audience listened as though hypnotized, he droned on and on of the supreme wisdom of the East, never once explaining why the world's highest incident of disease, death, and illiteracy endured at the fount of the said wisdom. Roy was a little stunned to find such a one as Moira Langtry present. She just wasn't the type. He was aware of her puzzlement when she saw him, but he had his reasons for being there. It was cheaper than movies and twice as funny. Also, while he was doing very well, as it was, he was not blind to the possibilities of doing better. The audiences were mostly well-to-do boobs, middle-aged widows, and spinsters, women suffering from a vague itch which might be scratched for a bundle. The clown finished his act. Baskets were passed for the adoration offering. Moira tossed her program in one of them and walked out. Grinning, Dillon followed her. She was lingering in the lobby, making a business out of pulling on her gloves. As he approached, she looked up with cautious approval. Now, what was a nice girl like you doing in a place like that?
I just dropped in for a glass of yogurt.
Oh, it's a good thing I didn't offer you a martini.
It certainly is. I won't settle for less than a double scotch.
They took it from there. It took them rapidly to where they were now. Lately, today in particular, he sensed that she wanted it to take them somewhat further. There was just one way of handling that, in his opinion, with a light touch. No one could simultaneously laugh and be serious. He let his hand walk down her body and come to rest on her navel. You know something? If you put a raisin in that, you could pass as a cookie.
Don't.
Or you could draw a ring around it and pretend you're a donut.
I'm beginning to feel like a donut. The part in the middle. But you see what I'm driving at, Roy? We don't know a thing about each other. We're not friends. We're not even acquainted. It's just been early to bed and early to bed from the time we met.
You said you weren't knocking it.
I'm not. It's very necessary to me. But I don't feel that it should begin and end with that. It's like trying to live on mustard sandwiches.
And you want pâté?
Steak. Something nourishing. Oh, hell, Roy. I don't know. Maybe it isn't on the menu. Maybe I'm in the wrong restaurant.
Madame is too cruel. Pierre will drown himself in the soup.
Pierre doesn't care if Madame lives or dies. He's made that pretty clear.
She started to rise with a finality of movement. He caught her and pulled her back to bed. I'm trying to tell you something. That I like you and that I'm lazy. I don't want to look any further. So just show me the price tag, and if I can, I'll buy.
That's better. I have an idea it might be quite profitable for both of us.
So, where do we begin? A few evenings on the town, a fling at Las Vegas?
No, I guess not. Maybe you couldn't afford it.
Surprise. I wouldn't even make you pay your own way.
That isn't the kind of thing I have in mind anyway. If we're going someplace, it ought to be the other end of the street. You know, relaxed and quiet so we can talk for a change.
Well, La Jolla's nice this time of year.
La Jolla's nice any time of year. But are you sure you can afford...
One more word of that song, and you'll have the reddest butt in La Jolla. People will think it's another sunset. She laughed fondly and got up. When she was dressed, she knelt again at his bedside for a goodbye kiss.
Are you sure you're all right, Roy? You look rather pale.
Will this woman never leave? She puts me through a double shift, and then she says I look pale. She left, smiling smugly, very pleased with herself. Roy arose wearily, his legs wobbling as he made the round trip to the bathroom. He dropped back down on the bed in a heap, worried about himself for the first time. What could be the cause of this strange, overpowering fatigue? Not Moira, surely. Not the fact that he'd eaten very little during the past 3 days. He had often had spells where he didn't feel hungry, and this had been one of them. Whatever he ate bounced back in a brownish-colored liquid. Frowning, he leaned forward and examined himself. There was a faint purplish-yellow bruise on his stomach, but it didn't hurt any more, unless he pushed on it very hard. He'd had no pain since the day he was slugged. So? He shrugged and lay back down. It was just one of those things, he guessed. He didn't feel sick. If a man was sick, he felt sick. His eyes closed and stayed closed. That was a little after noon. When he opened them again, twilight was shading the room and the phone was ringing. He looked around wildly, not recognizing where he was, not knowing where he was, lost in a world that was as strange as it was frightening. Then, drifting back into consciousness, he picked up the phone. Yeah, what? What? How's that again? For what the clerk was saying made no sense at all. A visitor, Mr. Dillon, a very attractive young lady. She says she's your mother. He wanted nothing from Lily. She had given him nothing when he needed it, when he was too small to get for himself, and he wasn't letting her into the game at this late date. He'd taken everything she had to hand out, and it hadn't made a dent in him. He damn well mustn't ever let her think that it had. It would take a lot better woman than Lily Dillon to get to him. But that is getting ahead of the story. New York is a 2-hour ride from Baltimore. At 17 going on 18, Roy went there. Needing to earn and to be paid immediately, he took work selling on a flat commission, door-to-door stuff, magazines, photo coupons, cooking utensils, vacuum cleaners, anything that looked promising. All of it promised much and gave little. The selling was no good, but he knew of nothing else. He was irked with himself. Here he was, 19, going on 20, and already a failure. What was wrong with him, anyway? What had Lily had that he didn't have? Then he stumbled on to the 20s. It was a fluke. The chump, the proprietor of a cigar store, had pulled it on himself. Preoccupied, Roy had continued to fumble for a coin after receiving the change from the bill, and the fidgety storekeeper, delayed and waiting on other customers, had lost patience. For Pete's sake, mister, it's only a nickel. Just pay me the next time you're in. Then he threw back the 20, and Roy was a block away before he realized what had happened. On the heels of the realization came another. An ambitious young man did not wait for such happy accidents. He created them, and he forthwith started to do so. He was coldly told off at 2 places. At 3 others, it was pointed out, more or less politely, that he was not entitled to the return of his 20. At the remaining 3, he collected. He was exuberant at his good luck. He wondered if there were any gimmicks similar to the 20s, ways of picking up as much money in a few hours as a fool made in a week. There were. He was introduced to them that night in a bar, whence he had gone to celebrate. A customer sat down next to him, jostling his elbow. A little of his drink was spilled, and the man apologetically insisted on buying him a fresh one. Then he bought still another round. At this point, of course, Roy wanted to buy a round, but the man's attention had been diverted. He was peering down at the floor, then reaching down and picking up a dice cube which he laid on the bar. "Did you drop this, pal?" "No." "Well, look, I don't like to drink so fast. But if you want to roll me for a round, just to keep things even." They rolled. Roy won, which naturally wouldn't do at all. They rolled again for the price of 4 drinks, and this time the guy won. And, of course, that wouldn't do either. He just wouldn't allow it. Hell, they were just swapping drinks, friendly-like, and he certainly wasn't going to walk out of here a winner. "We'll roll for 8 drinks this time. Well, call it $5, even. And then the tat, with its rapidly doubling bets, is murder on a fool. Roy's griftings were down the drain in 20 minutes. In another 10, all of his honest money had followed it. The guy felt very bad about it. He said so himself. Roy must take back a couple of bucks of his loss, and... But the taste of the grift was so strong in Roy's mouth, the taste and the smell. He said firmly that he would take back half of the money. The grifter, his name was Mintz, could keep the other half for his services as an instructor in swindling. Now, you can begin the lessons right now. You start with that dice gimmick you just worked on me. In the end, they adjourned to one of the booths, and that night, and for some nights afterward, they played the roles of teacher and pupil. Mintz held back nothing. For here was a blessed chance to drop pretense. He could show how smart he was, as his existence normally precluded doing, and do it in absolute safety. Mintz did not like the 20s. It took a certain indefinable something which he did not have. Mintz particularly liked the tat. Hook a group of guys on that tat, and you had it made for the week. The tat must always be played on a very restricted surface, a bar or a booth table. Thus you could not actually roll the die, although of course you appeared to. You shook your hand vigorously, holding the cube on a high point, never shaking it at all, and then you spun it out, letting it skid and topple, but never turned. If the marks became suspicious, you shot out of a cup, or more likely a glass, since you were in a bar room. But again, you did not really shake the die. You held it, as before, clicking it vigorously against the glass in a simulated rattle, and then you spun it out as before. It took practice, sure. Everything did. If things got too warm, the bartender would often give you a takeout for a good tip. Call you to the phone or say that the cops were coming or something like that. There were 2 highly essential details of grifting which Mintz did not explain to his pupil. One of them defied explanation. It was an acquired trait, something each man had to do on his own and in his own way. That is, retaining a high degree of anonymity while remaining in circulation. You couldn't disguise yourself naturally. It was more a matter of not doing anything, of avoiding any mannerism, any expression, any tone or pattern of speech, any posture or gesture or walk, anything at all that might be remembered. Thus the first unexplained essential. Presumably, Mintz didn't explain the second one because he saw no need to. It was something that Roy must certainly know. The lessons ended. Roy industriously went to work on the grift. He acquired a handsome wardrobe. He moved to a good hotel, indulging himself extravagantly. He still built up a roll of more than $4,000. Months passed. Then one day, when he was eating in an Astoria section lunchroom, a detective came in looking for him. Conferring with the proprietor, he described Roy to a T. He had no photo of him, but he did have a police artist's reconstruction, and it was an excellent likeness. Roy could see them looking down his way as they talked, and he thought wildly of running. Probably the only thing that kept him from running was the weakness in his legs. And then he looked at himself in the back counter mirror, and he breathed a sigh of relief. The day had turned warm after he left his hotel, and he'd checked his hat, coat, and tie in a subway locker. Then, only an hour or so ago, he'd got a Butch-style haircut. So he was changed, considerably, enough anyway to keep him from being collared, but he was shaken right down to his shoe soles. He sneaked back to his hotel room, wondering if he'd ever have the guts to work again. He stayed in the hotel until dark, and then he went looking for Mintz. Mintz was gone from the small hotel where he'd lived. He'd left months ago, leaving no forwarding address. Roy started hunting for him. By sheer luck, he found him in a bar 6 blocks away. The grifter was horrified when Roy told him what had happened. "You mean you've been working here all this time? You've been working steady?" "My God, do you know where I've been the last 6 months? 12 places, all the way to the coast and back." "But why? I mean, New York's a big city. Why?" Mintz cut him off impatiently. New York wasn't a big city. It just had a lot of people in it, and they were crammed into a relatively small area. And no, you didn't help your odds much by getting out of Manhattan into the other boroughs. Not only did you keep bumping into the same people who worked in Manhattan and lived in Astoria, Jackson Heights, etc., but you were more conspicuous there, easier to be spotted by the fools. And, kid, a blind man could spot you. Look at that haircut. Look at the fancy wristwatch and them 3-tone sports shoes. Now, why don't you wear a black eye patch, too, and a mouthful of gold teeth?" Roy reddened. He asked if every city was like this. Did you have to keep jumping from place to place, using up your capital and having to move on just about the time you got to know your way around? "What do you want? Egg in your beer?" "You can usually play a fairly long stand in Los Angeles because it ain't just one town. It's a county full of towns. And with traffic so bad and a lousy transportation system, the people don't mix around like they do in New York. But that still doesn't mean you can run wild, kid. You're a grifter, see? A thief. You got no home and no friends and no visible means of support. And you damn well better not ever forget it." "I won't, but Mintz, yeah." Roy smiled and shook his head, keeping his thought to himself. Suppose I did have a home, a regular place of residence. Suppose I had hundreds of friends and acquaintances. Suppose I had a job and then there was a knock on the door, and he said, "Come in, Lily." And his mother came in. She didn't seem to have aged a year in the 7 since he'd last seen her. He was 25 now, which meant she was crowding 39. But she appeared to be in her early 30s, say about 31 or 2. She looked like, well, of course, Moira Langtry. That was who she reminded him of. You couldn't say they actually looked like each other, but they were both brunettes and about the same size. But there was absolutely no facial resemblance. It was more a type similarity than a personal one. They were both members of the same flock. Women who knew just what it took to preserve and enhance their natural attractiveness. Women who were either endowed with what it took or spared no effort in getting it. Lily took a chair diffidently, unsure of her welcome, quickly explaining that she was in Los Angeles on business.
"I'm handling playback money at the tracks, Roy. I'll be getting back to Baltimore as soon as the races are over."
The explanation was reasonable. Playback, knocking the odds down on a horse by heavy pari-mutuel betting, was common in big-time bookmaking. "I'm glad to see you, Lily. I'd have been hurt if you hadn't dropped by."
"And I'm glad to see you, Roy. Roy, what's this all about? Why are you living in a place like this?"
"What's wrong with it?"
"Stop kidding me. It isn't you, that's what's wrong. Just look at it. Look at those corny clown pictures. That's a sample of my son's taste. Roy Dillon goes for corn."
Roy would have laughed if he hadn't been so weak. The 4 pictures were his own addition to the decorations. Concealed in their box frames was his grifted dough, $52,000 in cash. He murmured that he had rented the place as he found it, the best he could afford. After all, he was just a commissioned salesman.
And that's another thing. 4 years in a town like Los Angeles and a peanut-selling job is the best you can do? You expect me to believe that? It's a front, isn't it? This dump is a front. You're working an angle, and don't tell me you're not, because I wrote the book.
Lily, mind your own damn business.
You don't have to do it, Roy. You've got so much on the ball. So much more than I ever had, and you know what it does to a person, Roy?
His eyes were closed, an apparent signal to shut up or get out. She came over to the side of the bed. Timidly, she put the palm of her hand to his forehead, let out a startled gasp.
Why, Roy, you're ice cold. What?
Light bloomed over his pillows as she switched on the table lamp. He heard another gasp.
Roy, what's the matter? You're as white as a sheet.
Nothing. No sweat, Lily. Suddenly, he had become terribly frightened. He knew, without knowing why, that he was dying, and with a terrible fear of death was an unbearable sadness. Unbearable because there was no one who cared, no one at all to share it with him.
Only one death, Roy? Well, what are you kicking about? They can't eat you, can they? They can kill you, but they can't eat you.
Don't laugh at me.
I'm not laughing, honey. Listen to me, Roy. You don't seem to be sick, no fever, or... Where do you hurt? Did someone hurt you?
Hit. 3 days ago.
3 days ago? How? Where were you hit? What? Wait a minute, darling. Just wait until Mother makes a phone call, and then...
In what was record time for the Grosvenor Carlton, she got an outside line.
Lily Dillon, doctor. I work for Justice Amusement Company out of Baltimore, and... What? Don't you brush me off, Buster. Don't you tell me you never heard of me. If I have to have Bobo Justice call you... Well, all right then. Let's see how fast you can get over here.
She slammed down the receiver and turned back to Roy. The doctor came, out of breath and looking a little sullen, then forgetting his wounded dignity as his eyes drank in Lily. So sorry I was abrupt, Mrs. Dillon. Now, don't tell me this strapping young man can be your son.
Never mind that. Now, do something for him. I think he's in a pretty bad way.
Well, now, let's just see. He moved past her, looked down at the pale figure on the bed. Abruptly, his light manner washed away, and his hand moved quickly, testing Roy's heart, probing for pulse and blood pressure. How long's he been like this, Mrs. Dillon?
I don't know. He was in bed when I came in about an hour ago. We talked, and he seemed to be all right, except that he kept getting weaker and
I bet he did. Any history of ulcers?
No. I mean, I'm not sure. I haven't seen him in 7 years, and what's the matter with him, doctor?
Do you know whether he's been in any kind of accident during the last few days? Anything that might have injured him internally?
No. Well, yeah, he was. He was trying to tell me about it. 3 days ago, he was hit in the stomach. Some barroom drunk, I suppose.
Any vomiting afterwards? Coffee-colored? The doctor yanked down the sheet, nodding grimly at the sight of the bruise. Well?
I don't know.
What's his blood type? Do you know that?
No,
He dropped the sheet and picked up the phone. As he summoned an ambulance, he stared at Lily with a kind of worried reproach. He hung up the phone. I wish you'd known his blood type. If I could have got some blood into him now, instead of having to wait until he's typed...
Is it... He'll be all right, won't he?
Well, we'll do all we can. Oxygen will help some.
But will he be all right?
His blood pressure is under 100, Mrs. Dillon. He's had an internal hemorrhage.
I asked you a question. I asked you...
I'm sorry. The answer is no. I don't think he can live until he gets to the hospital. Lily swayed. She got hold of herself, drawing herself straight, making her voice firm, and she spoke to the doctor very quietly.
My son will be all right. If he isn't, I'll have you killed.
Carol Roberg arrived at the hospital at 5 in the afternoon, an hour before the beginning of her shift. The mere thought of being late to work terrified her, and by coming so early she could get a bargain-priced meal in the employees' cafeteria before going on duty. That was very important to Carol, a good meal at a low price. Even when she wasn't hungry, which was seldom, even in America, where no one ever seemed to be hungry, she was always subtly worried about when she would eat again. Her white nurse's uniform was so stiffly starched that it gave off little pops and crackles as she hurried down the marble corridor. Cut over long, in the European fashion, it made her look like a child dressed in its mother's clothes, and the skirt and cuffs flared upward at the corners, seeming to set a pattern for her eyes, her mouth, her brows, and the tips of her short-bobbed hair. All her features had an amusing, turned-up look, and no amount of inner solemnity could conquer it. Entering the cafeteria, she moved straight to the long serving counter, blushing self-consciously, careful to avoid looking at anyone who might be looking her way. Several times, here and elsewhere, she had been drawn into joining other diners, and the experience had been painfully awkward. The men, interns and technicians, made jokes which were beyond her limited idiom, so that she never knew quite what her response should be. As for the other nurses, they were nice enough. They wanted to be friendly. But there was a great gulf between them which only time could bridge. She did not talk or think or act as they did, and they seemed to take her ways as a criticism of theirs. Carol took a tray and silverware from the serving counter and studied the steamy expanse of food. Carefully weighing each item against the other, she made her selections. She was hesitating at the dessert section, about to decide that she could have a strudel in view of her other economies, when she heard the voices back down the line, the fat woman talking to another attendant.
Kosher kid can really put it away, can't she? When she gets it for nothing, sure, that's how them kipes get ahead.
Carol froze for a moment. Then stiffly she moved on, paying her check and carrying her tray to a table in a distant corner of the room. She began to eat methodically, forcing down the suddenly tasteless food until it once again became tasteful and desirable. That was the way one had to do the best one could and accept things as they were. Usually they did not seem so bad after a while. If they were not actually good, then they became so by virtue of the many things that were worse. Eating was better than starving, living better than dying. Even a simulated friendliness was better than none at all. People had to care, at least a little, to pretend. Her own kith and kin, immigrants like her, had not always done that. She had come to the United States under the auspices of relatives, an aunt and uncle who had fled Austria before the Anschluss. Now, well-to-do, they had taken her into their home and given her probationary status as a daughter, but with certain unstated stipulations, that she became one of them, that she live as they lived without regard to how she had lived before, and Carol could not do that. The ritual dining, the numerous sets of dishes, each to be used only for a certain kind of food, were almost offensive to her. So much waste in a world filled with want. Because they were good to her or meant to be, she tried to be as they were. But mere trying, willingness, was not enough for them. They accused her of abandoning her faith, one that she could never remember knowing. Their tyranny in its own way seemed almost as bad as that she had fled from, and at last she had had to flee from them. Life outside the refugee world wasn't easy. It often seemed to be a world with quite as many prejudices as the one she had left. But it was not always that way. There were some people who were completely indifferent to what she had been. They, Mrs. Dillon was their best example, accepted her for what she was now, and she saw Mrs. Dillon approaching, moving past the other tables with her easy imperiousness. Hastily, Carol set down her teacup and came to her feet.
Please sit down, Mrs. Dillon. I will get you some tea. Yes, some coffee, something to eat. Nothing. I won't be staying at the hospital this evening, and I wanted to talk to you before I left. There is something wrong I have done? No, you're just doing fine. Everything's fine. Now get yourself some more tea if you like. There's no hurry. I'd better not. It is almost 6, and the other nurse. I'm paying the other nurse, too. She's working for me, not the hospital. If she doesn't want to work a little overtime for extra pay, she can quit.
Carol nodded and murmured meekly. This was a side of Mrs. Dillon she had never seen before. Lily's smile returned.
Now, just relax and rest easy, Carol. I like your work. I like you. I hope you like me, too. My son and I. Oh, I do very much. You have been very nice to me. Why is it that you don't have a regular job, that you're just working extra? Well, the hospital, almost every hospital, it graduates its own nurses, and I am not such a graduate. Then the regular jobs, like in the doctor's office, they usually want skills that I do not have, often bookkeeping and shorthand, and I understand. How do you make out on this special duty work? All right? It depends on how much work I can get, and that is not always a great deal. And, of course, there are the fees to the nurses' registry. But, well, it is enough. When I know more and when I better understand English. Yeah, sure. How old are you, Carol? 27. Oh, I wouldn't have thought you were that old. I feel much older, sometimes, like I had lived forever. But yes, I am 27. Well, no matter. Any boyfriends? Going steady with anyone? No? A girl like you must have plenty of opportunities.
Carol shook her head, her upturned features humorously solemn. She lived in a furnished room, she pointed out, and she could not properly receive young men in it. Then, since she worked irregular hours, it was not possible to plan ahead, nor to be sure of keeping a social engagement if any were made.
Also, the young men try to do certain things. They often... I am greatly embarrassed.
Lily nodded gently, feeling a strange tenderness toward the girl. Here was someone absolutely real. Perhaps under different circumstances she might have turned out as wholesome and honest and real as Carol was. But she shook herself mentally. To hell with that noise. She was what she was, and thus Roy had become what he was, and there was nothing to be done about her, assuming that she wanted anything done. But perhaps it wasn't too late
You're probably wondering why I was so nosy. Inquisitive, I mean. Well, it's like this. I don't want to jinx my son by saying that he's going to be all right, but... Oh, I'm sure he will be, Mrs. Dillon. Don't say it. It might bring bad luck. Let's just say that when and if he is able to leave the hospital, I'd like you to go on looking after him for a while. At my apartment, I mean. You think you'd like that?
Carol nodded eagerly, her eyes shining. She'd already had more than 2 weeks of steady employment with Mrs. Dillon, more than she'd ever had before. What a wonderful thing it would be to go on working for her and her nice son indefinitely.
Well, that's fine then. It's all settled. Now, I've got to run along, but... Yeah? I was just wondering... if Mr. Dillon would want me. He is always very kind, but